Jim Cornette will be answering your questions, which are sent in a number of ways to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com or on Twitter using the hashtag CornyDriveThru. I'm your host, the great Brian Last. And with that, good morning. Let's go to Jim Cornette.
Oh, God, that was unwieldy. And what happened to, and you are our friends. What happened to that? Because you need to bring the Cult of Cornette listeners of the program here into our bosoms, our wombs, as it were, and bundle and cuddle them and call them George and bring them in. But that's how George got his name, George the Rat, the much maligned and George the Rat, whose memory has been besmirched by the Artful Dodger. But George the Rat got, because he was so cute. We said we will love him and squeeze him and call him George. From the cartoon. You are disappointing me in a number of ways. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Funny, the more you talk, I'm thinking, which way did he go, George? Is actually
well, oh, for heaven's sake. That's not, well, we wouldn't need to name somebody which way did he go. It just doesn't make any sense. Your pop culture knowledge is disappointing me on a number of levels here lately. But at least bring them in. Friends, and you are our friends. Every time I hear that, friends, I think about Boyd Pierce. But what a nice old man. You know, it's a shame if anybody knows who Boyd Pierce is these days at all anymore. They probably are making fun of him because of his clothes, because they don't get the gimmick. But Boyd in the locker room, Mid-South TV in Shreveport, he had this great old radio announcer's voice. He still sounded, just Texas country, but it had mellifluous tones like one of those old radio announcers' friends. Do you poop out at parties? Do you stoop and strain? Try a bottle of Dr. Proctor's Red Rectum Rockers. They're good. And he was always telling jokes or crap. Boyd Pierce, for the uninitiated, was the ring announcer on Mid-South Wrestling Television that wore the wild, outlandish, brightly colored suits. And the old and the one who would sometimes introduce Bill Watts, he basically, that's what Boyd was in later years. And now people watching on a network are like, who's this fucking guy, right? But Boyd was a big deal in Texas wrestling all over the state, going back to at least the 50s, probably the 40s. And the way I understood it in the 80s, when I first met him down there, he had money. He wasn't, doing this for a job or anything. He did it because he loved the business and he'd been around it for 40 years. And he had done programs, written for the programs. He had done television at one point all over the state of Texas for the different offices, and had done Watts's Mid-South TV in the early days because he was a noted name announcer at that time in that part of the country. And he had evolved that gimmick, and all the fans just loved him. He was the local, uncle, grandpa, whatever, but he had those wild-colored suits, and because he just had them made, I guess, at the whim, so I know he had some money, but some of them looked like couch covers, and others looked like, your grandmother's drapes, and others were, I remember, when I first got there, I'd heard of Boyd and I knew, from the announcer, but I did see it in person. I'm like, fuck, my gimmick is I'm supposed to have these fucking obnoxious suits and I look like a banker next to Boyd. But he would even, if he had like a red jacket and blue pants and red shoes, he'd have blue socks. He'd raise up his pant legs so you could see his blue socks, and he'd open up his jacket and he'd have red and blue pins inside the jacket pocket. The pins to match the suit. He was what a fucking gimmick. Yeah. Back when guys were gimmicks instead of, were given gimmicks. But
plus he made a ton of money selling gimmicks. All those Wrestling King of Sports
things
came from him, right? The keychains, everything.
He did a lot of the gimmicks. Like I said, he'd done a lot of the programs. He had done announcing various various shows for years, not just ring announcing, but I mean the, television announcing. And, I don't even know this, but at the time, of course, Watts started Mid-South. Boyd was a, legendary announcer. And I think he may have done work for Leroy McGurk. So and then later on, as Watts decided he wanted to really expand, and Boyd was very regional in his appeal, and he was getting older. And Watts also had that itch where he wanted to tell his own stories, right? He's the booker, but he's going to hammer this shit over on commentary. So it became Boyd would basically say, hello again, everybody, and welcome to Mid-South Wrestling. And here's the Oklahoma Stampeder himself, the president of Mid-South Sports, Cowboy Bill Watts. And the next words Boyd would say in that 1 hour program was, well, that's it. We'll see you next week, folks, on Mid-South Wrestling. He was just there because the people still loved him so much. He was the link to, they didn't want to upset the apple cart too much. And then finally it became every 2 weeks he'd rotate with JR, and then it was JR and Watts pretty much. But
No. They had two teams. It was Boyd and Bill Watts. They kept
that's right.
Team.
Boyd
and then it was
Watts,
Jim Ross and Joel Watts.
Yes, that's right. And oh my God, and Joel was. But anyway, Boyd could call a pretty good fucking old fashioned Southern wrestling match in that accent too. He was a old fashioned announcer. He was really cool and smooth and everything. But anyway, what was I going to goddamn say?
You can't move on before we talk Reeser Bowden now.
Well, no, but hold on a second. No, I was going to say something else about Boyd, and you distracted before we talk about the living corpse, Reeser Bowden, who was the exact opposite. Instead of an over-the-top personality, had no personality. On one of the local promos, I actually did this. I had a pocket mirror, and I went up to Reeser Bowden and held a mirror up in front of his mouth. I just want to check and see if you're still with us, Reeser. But he was the station announcer and a Channel 3 guy there in Shreveport when they did the TV there, and then they still did it in Shreveport when they moved the Irish McNeil. They did the promos there also, so that's how he was. But he didn't want to be the over-the-top wrestling announcer to lend his gravitas to anything, but at the same time, he couldn't say anything sideways or Watts would have bitch slapped him, so he would just totally just deadpan. It was brutal. But no, Boyd, what I was going to say with Boyd was, he was an obsessive collector also, because I have some old Texas programs that he's featured in, and he even had a wrestling match that were from his collection, actually, that a guy in North Carolina passed on to me that had befriended him, and he had sent him some, but he had a huge collection of stuff at one time. I don't know whatever happened to all of it, but anyway, he'd been figured in, and what I was going to say was, he was living in a suburb of Dallas when he was working for Watts, and he'd be in the Superdome. He wouldn't miss Superdome. And he'd be sometimes at Oklahoma, and he'd do the TV down in Shreveport. But he never, when we went to World Class, he never even appeared, showed up, walked in the door, said hello to anybody at a Dallas area or a World Class wrestling event, even though he lived there.
He hated Fritz, right?
Well, that's what I would love to know what started that, because that had to go back probably 20 years. But I even drove him one time over to Shreveport to TV and back. When I'd moved to Dallas, they booked me back over to manage the Guerreros against the Rock and Roll on Shreveport TV. And Boyd called me and said, well, I know you're going to be going over there now that you're over this way. I said, I'd be glad to take you, Boyd. And I picked him up at his hand, Burleson, Texas, and took him over and back. And he was just fucking hilarious. Just cool old guy. But anyway, friends, and you are our friends, try a bottle of Dr. Proctor's Red Rectum Rocker. You know what they're going to need Red Rectum Rockers for after I'm finished with them is the big Have a Beef with Jim Cornette celebration in Chicago